probably never leave me. And it was not necessarily in my treatment, but in the treatment of somebody else that I observed. This is this person who's unable to speak, and she's having that treatment. They have lasers, they have music going, and I think the whole office came in and started singing this song together to encourage her to be able to speak. And you just don't find that everywhere. That compassion for someone, and that the uniqueness to come and want to be a part of it and sing with joy and love, like that will probably never leave my mind. Like I honestly, I got goosebumps when I was watching it, and I thought, oh, God is most definitely present here.
So as a caregiver, you hold so much of their trauma in yourself. For me personally, I was trying to take his trauma, trying to take his pain, trying to take all of that into my own body so that he didn't have to feel that. And I thought that I had let it go, but until I sat with Dr. Jerry, I had not let go of it, obviously, because I still felt that tension in my body. But as soon as she did that to me, it was like a full release of just everything. And I let out a huge breath, and Jaden let out a huge breath at the exact same time that I did. We're so connected that if I let my trauma go from this situation, he'll feel that trauma leave his body too. And then he can feel the peace, then I think he has the opportunity to heal.
We have some new technology. This is SoftWave. I'm extremely excited about this for multiple reasons. We're one of the first clinics in the world to be using it for brain applications. I've had some firsthand experience on some amazing regenerative capacity with this machine on what it can do for the brain, restoring function extremely quickly, getting people out of pain faster than I've ever seen before. I've literally seen, even this week, I've seen primitive reflexes literally inhibit or integrate faster than I've ever seen before when we use it on the brain, but then also specifically for those primitive reflexes. We're the first to do it, that kind of application, which is really exciting. We'll continue to do some pilot studies. We're working in collaboration with SoftWave to do those research studies. So extremely excited. We're also using this now in combination with our B-cell procedure, using it before and after to help enhance the stem cells, which it is clinically proven, but also proven in the research to enhance, upregulate that stem cell response. So very excited about that.
Well, thank you so much for joining. I know we are virtual, and so I hope you can hear me okay, and you can see me okay. I'm not able to see you all, and so if something is going awry, please just speak up and let me know, okay? But I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be with you all this morning. So I'm going to set a timer on my end just so I make sure that I stop with plenty of time for some questions. But so just a little bit about me. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I am live in the Waco area and received my degree in social work as well as a master's in divinity from Baylor University, and have been practicing in the field of social work for 16 years now, and specifically in the field of grief and loss for about 7 years now. And so I am the owner and therapist of Bud and Blossom Counseling, where I provide support for grief and loss to children, teens, and adults, both in individual therapy settings and as well as group settings. And so one of my passions in this world is getting to talk about grief and loss, because I feel like it's just something that we all walk through and we all face, but oftentimes is not something that we are great at talking about. Kind of in larger society. And so anytime I have an opportunity to talk and share about grief, I welcome it. And so today, I am specifically wanting to talk about a part of grief known as ambiguous loss. And so my hope today is that we will define what ambiguous loss is, what it looks like, all the different ways that someone might experience ambiguous loss. But then also, what are some just truths about grief and the grieving experience? And then, as it relates specifically to ambiguous loss, what are some unique ways of coping when we name that we are experiencing ambiguous loss? And so, excuse me, ambiguous loss. And so that's my hope for today. I will leave some time at the end for questions, but like I said, if something is going on and you can't hear me or see me, feel free to interrupt. So, all right. So I think as we begin, it's important to define a couple of terms that I'm going to kind of be using a little bit interchangeably today. Um, and so the first of those terms is loss. And so when we think about loss is really something that happens when an event happens that we as an individual perceive that event to be negative in some way. It can result in long-term changes in our social situations, in relationships, and our way of viewing the world or viewing ourselves. And I think most of the time when we think about the word loss, we think about loss as it relates to death. And while certainly that is one of the most common forms of loss, it's not the only form of loss. And so today we're really going to be talking about a different kind of loss, which is this idea of an ambiguous loss and defining what that is. But loss is this all-encompassing word for an event that changes the way we view the world and we view ourselves. So then when we think about grief, so grief then is a normal human response that we experience to any loss. And so oftentimes when we experience a non-death loss, we think, well, we can't possibly grieve that because there's not a death involved. So how do we have grief around that? And so when we think about grief as this normal human response to loss, we can see that we do experience grief and we have this grieving process and journey that can happen when we experience a non-death loss. And so to further define grief, I like this definition by Victor Yalom. And he says that I think it's probably important to acknowledge and recognize that grief is a reaction to loss. We often confuse it as a reaction to death. It's really just a very natural reaction to loss. And so we can experience grief obviously when someone we're attached to dies. But we can also experience it when we lose any significant form of attachment. You can certainly experience grief in divorce, in separation, in losing an object that's particularly meaningful or significant, in losing a job that has meaning or significance. Whenever we experience an attachment and we experience loss in that attachment, grief becomes the natural way that we respond to that. And so I want to stop here and talk about what are some truths about grief, whether we're talking about death or non-death losses. So these are things that are true about grief, regardless of the type of loss. And so the first thing that I want to acknowledge is that everyone's experience in grief is uniquely their own. No two people experience grief in the same way. And so everyone's experience is their own. And that's true even within the same family dynamic. So even within the same family, you might have two people who experience that loss very differently, and their expression of grief may look very different. Um, and so a lot of times we talk about, when we think about grief being individual, grief is not, grief is not right or wrong. Sometimes it's just different, right, for each person. Um, Another kind of truth about grief is this idea that we can get over it somehow, that there's a sense that we can get over it or we need to move on. A lot of times people hear that when they have experienced some type of loss. And so um, our goal in grief is not to get over it, but rather it's how do we learn how to incorporate it into life that is continuing to move forward, whether we feel present to that moving forward or not. Um, Another truth about grief I want to share is that there's no set timeline. There's no set point at which we're going to start feeling better um, as a result of a loss. And so I use this phrase a lot when I'm talking to people about timeline, and it takes as long as it takes. And it's this idea that um, grief is something, if we define loss as this event that has happened that changes who we are and how we see the world, um, that often doesn't change. That way of looking at life post a loss means that is with us always, right? And so, so trying to put a timeline to when we might be better or be healed or um, over a loss just doesn't really work with how most people experience a loss in their lives. Another truth is that there are lots of factors that influence the intensity. So, how greatly we experience all of the emotions and all of the things with grief and the duration. So, the length of time that we experience that. So, there are lots of factors that influence that. The nature of the loss, how we've responded to losses that maybe we have experienced before, um, our support system, and also just our cultural beliefs about loss and even mental health can impact that. I've mentioned this other one already, but I think it notes saying it twice. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. There's no rule book. There's no, this is, here are the steps, here are the stages, this is how it works. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later on in the presentation, but there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And a lot of times we have these societal expectations of what is and isn't allowed in grief. And sometimes we have internalized expectations of what is right or wrong when it comes to grief. And the reality is that they're just there aren't grief doesn't work that way. There aren't these right or wrong ways of doing it. Now, are there times that we might cope with grief in a way that is not healthy or might be harmful to ourselves or somebody else? Yes, that can be true about a grief experience, um, but when we're thinking about all of the range of emotions and cognitive and physical responses that we might have to a loss, all of those things can look very different. And I've mentioned this already, but grief is also something that's greatly impacted by our culture, who we are, the things that we believe about this world, and greatly impact how we view and process loss. And so, a lot of the conversation today around this idea of ambiguous loss is going to come from Pauline Boss. So, Pauline Boss has been writing about ambiguous loss for well over a decade now. And so, a lot of what I am sharing today comes from her work. And so, as we begin to think about this, I just want to define a little bit of ambiguous grief through the eyes of Pauline Boss. And so she says this about it. She says that absence and presence are not absolutes, and that it is possible to grieve someone who is still alive. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on and talking about today, of how do we begin to think about how it's possible for us to grieve someone who might still be alive. And so, ambiguous loss, as defined by Boss, is a loss that remains unclear and thus without resolution. Um, it's the external situation of a relationship that's ruptured by ambiguity. There's a lack of certainty about the loved one's presence or absence in our lives. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. And so Pauline Boss identifies two different types of ambiguous loss. And so we'll go into those types. But first, before we kind of break those down, I want to note that both of these types of ambiguous loss have some things in common. And so first is that they defy resolution. So there's no clear set resolution that can happen to this loss sometimes. Um, the second thing is that often there's no officially verified end. So there's no sometimes ending point to where we can point to, okay, like we're done with this loss. There's an ending point to this loss. Oftentimes that doesn't exist when we're talking about a type of ambiguous loss. And then the third thing, and I think this is a really important aspect of ambiguous loss, is that ambiguous losses are very relational. They're about our bond and our attachment with another person. And that's really where this sense of loss comes into play. And so the first type of ambiguous loss that that Pauline Boss defines is one in which a grieving person is grieving a person who is physically absent but psychologically present. So the person is physically absent but psychologically present, and so that might be thinking about natural disasters, war, terrorism, kidnapping, runaway, disappearance, situations where maybe a person is perceived to be dead, but their body is missing, incarceration, immigration, foster care, adoption, divorce, relocation, military deployment, um, a, a loved one being in some type of care facility, or even estrangement in a relationship are all examples of where that person is physically absent, but psychologically they're still here and present with us. And so when we think about this type of loss, there are a couple of things that we note about it. And one thing that happens with this loss is that there's this sense of safety being unknown and uncertain, right? So our sense of safety is impacted. And then our sense of future. So the future sometimes might feel unknown or uncertain with this type of loss. Like we talked about earlier, there's no end point sometimes for this loss. And then another reality of this loss is that often there is little that can be fixed about this type of loss. And so that's one type of ambiguous loss. And so the second type ambiguous loss. And I think one that is one that we will probably spend the most time on is a type of loss where we are grieving a person who is physically present but psychologically absent. And so this happens when the person is with us, they are here, but there's been something that has changed cognitively or psychologically with that person that has impacted a relationship with that person. And so examples of this are, sorry, I don't know why that's popping up. Let me get this out of the screen. Okay, that's weird. So examples of this are Alzheimer's or dementia-related disease, someone who might be experiencing autism, someone who might be in a coma, someone who might have a chronic illness or severe mental illness, someone with substance abuse or even process addictions like behavioral addictions like food addiction, social media addiction, um, addiction to work. And then traumatic brain injuries would fall into this category of physically present but psychologically absent. And so when we think about this type of loss in particular, um, in this scenario, the relationship with that person is fundamentally changed. And that becomes a key point and a key part of the grief we experience in this loss. Just like the other type, there's no endpoint, and there's little that can be fixed in this type of loss. When we think about this type of loss, sometimes there's this tendency to minimize this type of loss. And so you might hear others say to you, or you might even say to yourself, well, we should just be grateful that they're here, that they're alive, that they are physically present. And when we say that, that minimizes that feeling or that sense of loss that we might have. And so I think the reality when we're thinking about grief is that we can both be grateful for a person's presence in our life, but also deeply grieve the life that we anticipated with that person, or the fact that what we had thought about this life has completely fundamentally been changed, and that we can hold both of those things to be true at the same time, and that expressing and letting ourselves name this as a loss in our life can be really helpful as we think about how we begin to incorporate that into our life. So I want to talk specifically about some things that we want to keep in mind, specifically about ambiguous loss. And some of this we've already mentioned. But the first is that when we're talking about ambiguous loss, it's a relational loss. I've said that before. And so what that means is that even though a person is still living, the relationship has been lost, it has been changed, or it's been disrupted in some way. And so there is this point of disconnection that is happening because of those things. We experience a loss of a relationship to that person in some way. Another thing to keep in mind about ambiguous loss is that there's a loss of control. And so a lot of times in our society, we value mastery. And so the nature of these losses is that there is almost always a want for control over a situation that cannot be controlled or changed. And so there's this sense of that goes back to that idea of like not being able often to fix the situation. And so there's this tension between wanting to control or fix what is happening and reconciling that with the idea of of that being completely out of our ability. Like, we don't have the ability to control or change this event that has happened, that has led to this feeling of loss that we are walking through. The third thing is that it is a stress model. And so when we think about stress, we as humans have a reaction, a bodily stress response sometimes. And so when we think about ambiguous loss through this lens of a stress model, we begin to see how the impacts of this loss are impacting us, emotionally, cognitively, physically, spiritually, behaviorally, right? And so, what's interesting about ambiguous loss is that the stressor that is being introduced in this loss is that ongoing ambiguity. And so, it's that sense of uncertainty that cannot be fixed, but only managed, that is causing that stress response in our bodies and in our life, right? Um, and so the last thing here is that the goal when we're thinking about ambiguous loss is this sense of tolerance of that ambiguity. And so, though those of you who may be coping with these losses have this want to fix the external situation, really the goal is, how do we begin to live with the uncertainty that exists here in this loss? How do we begin to be okay in the midst of all of that uncertainty? How do we begin to sit in that in some way? And so these are all things to keep in mind about that experience and what that might look like with ambiguous loss. So I want to talk just a little bit about realms of grief. Um, and so this is work from Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who is at the Center for Loss. And so really what he talks about are all the different ways that a person might experience grief or might have a response to grief. Another way of thinking about this is like symptoms. So like, what are symptoms that we might have related to grief? And so the reality is that whether the loss that we have experienced is a death or a non-death loss, these symptoms or these realms of grief impact us in a lot of the same ways. Um, and so when we think about our human response, these are all the different ways that grief may impact us. And so the first one I'll talk about is the emotional. And so that's usually the one that we think of most often when we think about grief. And so the emotional realm or the emotional symptoms are really all of those big emotions that we can think of that might come into a grief response. And so the ones that are most common for most people are sadness, anxiety, anger, depression, even suicidal thoughts. Sometimes this might look like feeling numb, feeling shock or disbelief, or feeling overwhelmed, um, feeling a sense of guilt, or feeling out of control of our own emotions, just feeling completely overwhelmed by those emotions. So, those are all things someone might experience on that kind of emotional realm of grief. And the interesting thing about the emotions is that sometimes it can be really difficult to pinpoint exactly what things we are feeling. And oftentimes we might be feeling multiple things all at the same time. Um, and the intensity of those emotions oftentimes comes in waves. And so we have times where we might be feeling really overwhelmed and feeling like the the waves of those intense emotions are just crashing and knocking us down. But then other times, we feel like we may be able to kind of wade into the water a little bit and without getting knocked down with those emotions. And that ebbs and flows over time. And that's really a normative part of a grief response. So then the next kind of realm of grief is physical. And so these are physical things that our body experiences as a result of a loss. And so that can look like changes in our sleep, either sleeping more or sleeping less. Same with appetite, eating more or eating less. Um, having changes in physical illness. So sometimes people just feel run down. And so maybe they are having more frequent coughs or cold-like symptoms because of just that being exhausted from this sense of loss and all that it encompasses. Sometimes this can also be physical pain. People report experiencing headaches or heart palpitations, shortness of breath, having like stomach GI type issues, just feeling like having stomach pains. And then for some people, it can look like panic or having kind of a panic attack response to a loss as well. All of those are things that people might experience physically as a result of a loss. Um, the next section is intellectual. I I often tell people when we are just getting to know each other and just starting to meet together that sometimes my job is to kind of put them at rest when they have this sense or this feeling that they are just going crazy because sometimes the way that they are experiencing grief just feels so out of normal to them, or it's like an out of body like experience. And oftentimes the things that bring that up the most are things that are in this intellectual realm. And so this might look like loss of concentration or a lessening of the attention span, so not being able um, to sit and read things or listen to a song or make it through an entire TV show. Completing tasks, so just being able to get things done, checked off a list. Sometimes this can also look like short-term memory loss or confusion, forgetfulness, feeling like you just have this sense of unreality about your life. And then sometimes it can look like having ruminating thoughts or just feeling like you are just constantly thinking about that person or all things that someone might experience in that intellectual realm. So then the social realm really refers to how loss impacts how we interact with other humans. Um, and this has really greatly been impacted by the pandemic as well. But um, a lot of people experience feelings of loneliness and isolation after they've experienced a loss. There's a sense sometimes of feeling like there are changes in relationships that happen with people in their lives, with their friends or family, where we felt like people that we thought would show up a certain way have not shown up in the way that we would expect them to, which creates tension in that relationship. And so, even being able to relate to people that maybe once were a part of our support system looks really different now that we're walking through loss. Those relationships don't feel like a safe place to show up with our authenticness, right? Sometimes. Um, it can also look like having more dependence on other people for things, right? We lose a little bit of sense of our own independence sometimes with a loss. It can look like a fear of being alone or withdrawal from other people or other activities that once brought us a sense of joy or contentment. The spiritual realm, so I think regardless of what faith or religion you may or may not belong to, we all experience grief um, in some type of spiritual way. And so for a lot of people, there's kind of these two sides to our spirituality, and most people kind of find themselves somewhere in the middle. But one way that a loss can impact a person's spirituality is to really be a lot of just doubt and anger, or to experience changes in their faith or religious practices, or confusion. And part of this is related to our idea of trying to make meaning out of a loss. And we'll talk about that meaning making here in just a little bit. Um, but those things can all be a part of that spiritual piece. And so it might be the other side of that is sometimes in loss, someone might find themselves drawing closer to their sense of spirituality. And so they find a lot of comfort in their religious or spiritual practices that becomes a big part of their support system. I think it's also important to note that for most religions, there is a social aspect to that. And so our spirituality can be impacted by some of those social changes as well, when we think about that. And then this last way is kind of the behaviorally. So, like, what are behavioral changes that we experience? It can look like just feeling more irritable, less patience with the world around us. Sometimes that can lead to kind of some more extreme behaviors like conflict, whether verbal or physical. It can also lead to feeling a sense of needing to kind of numb things. And so a lot of times that might lead to us turning towards substances, whether that's food or alcohol or other drugs, or just engaging in like kind of high risk behaviors that maybe we just wouldn't have thought of before. But those are all things that could happen in terms of kind of that behavioral response for grief. Okay. Um, so I think another important layer as we are talking about loss is this idea of having a concept of like secondary losses. And so what we mean by that is that often we might have kind of a defined main loss event, but then there are these secondary losses that are these kind of ripples that happen as a result of that loss that also impact our lives in significant ways. And so, one of the things that I think when we're thinking about how we begin to define this loss for ourselves, what is kind of our loss story, one thing that oftentimes we don't acknowledge are these secondary losses. So, what are these other ways that our lives have been impacted because of this sense of loss? Um, Sometimes we might experience this as invisible losses. And so these might be things that are not easily seen. They're abstract or figurative or existential. And then sometimes these are very tangible things. They can be physical, relational, or very distinguishable losses. And so some examples, so this is by no means an exhaustive list of secondary losses, but some things that come to mind. So when we think about concrete, so these are those more tangible losses: loss of a home, loss of possessions, loss of a business or job, loss of financial support, loss of friends or family. Those are all things that we might experience. when we think about relational secondary losses, so remember what we've said about ambiguous loss, that ambiguous loss is a relational loss. And so we have that relational loss, and then we can have these secondary relational losses in addition to that loss. And so that can look like divorce or loss from unsupportive friends or family in our lives. Loss of a family relationship due to conflict, loss of community, distance, feeling distant from a person, um, or especially when we're talking about caring for someone who might be sick in our lives. Changes in the way that we relate to friends can also be impacted by this. Another secondary loss is as it relates to our spiritual and belief systems. We've kind of talked about this earlier as well too, but we can have this loss of hope for the future, loss of goals or dreams, especially that involved our person, or a loss of a sense of life shared with another person. Another one is just simply a loss in the belief that we live in a safe, fair, and just world, can be a secondary loss that we might experience. And then another really important point of secondary losses is that in grief, we experience a loss of identity. Who we are, how we see ourselves, sometimes is greatly impacted by a loss that we experience. And so we might have a loss of our role in our family or in our friendship system. We might have a loss of a relationship or loss of a sense of purpose in life. We might be taking on this whole new role that we never expected to be in, which is a role of a caregiver that comes with its own stressors. We might see a loss in our own self confidence or our interest or our hobbies. Or we might even experience a loss of our own physical or mental abilities. We might feel discouraged or overwhelmed or fatigued or having, memory loss that we talked about earlier. And so those things impact our very own identity and how we see ourselves in this world. So those are all secondary losses that we might experience. And so some common concerns for someone who is grieving a non-death loss. So these are things that um you know things that I hear people say, like, this is sometimes what it's like, right? And so one of those is a lack of acknowledgement and validation. And so oftentimes ambiguous losses are disenfranchised. And what that means is that they're not losses that we feel like we can talk about openly and publicly. And so if we think back to what we've said earlier about how sometimes we tend to minimize this loss, right? That's all wrapped up in this. And so just having a lack of acknowledgement that this is loss or validating the feelings that we are feeling in this situation that we are going through has a profound impact on us. And so being able to acknowledge those things and have that validated can be really important. And I will say that some of these things that we're talking about, sometimes these things can be experienced even in a clinical role. I have talked to so many people who have been a part of just like the medical system where they have just felt like so many times things were just not acknowledged or validated, or sometimes even in like a clinical counseling relationship with someone who just didn't really have an understanding of ambiguous loss, who was guilty of not acknowledging and validating the importance of that loss for somebody. And so that very well could be a part of your story. And so it's important to acknowledge that. Another common concern is emotional intensity due to anxiety. And so we've talked about that sense of kind of control and how much kind of lack of control is a part of this idea of ambiguous loss. And so this emotional intensity can create a need for control. It can look like nervousness. It can look like just intensity, right? That we might have. Um, Another concern is that stress in the present. So we are experiencing physical stress due to the present situation that we are tending to, that we are dealing with in this moment. But that's coupled with also this uncertainty about the future. And so there's this loss in the present to deal with, while at the same time that added layer of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future, and that can be very complicated and compounding. Oh, and the last one is support systems burnout. And so I think oftentimes we expect some sort of improvement, or resolution to situations. And oftentimes, like we've said, that's just not the case with these kinds of losses. And so, burnout is something that can be a continuous struggle in this caregiver fatigue, having a lack of empathy in your own situation, or having a lack of empathy for other people's situations around you. And so there can be this empathetic overload from friends and professionals as well too, of just feeling like the overwhelmingness of it. And so those are all just some common things that people might experience. And so in the last few minutes that I have, so we're going to take just about 5 minutes to talk about this. So what do we do now that we've defined ambiguous loss and we've defined what this looks like? What do we do with it? Like, how do we begin to incorporate this loss into life that's moving forward? And so Pauline Boss offers kind of 6 goals of counseling for ambiguous loss. And so obviously, I come from this mental health background. And so this language is very important for me when I'm thinking about how do I help and support someone in ambiguous loss. But I think there are pieces of this as you're thinking about your own ability to cope with what's going on, that can be helpful takeaways from today. And so, as we've talked about already, many of these ambiguous losses are disenfranchised. And so, you may have been provided misguided support, even in a clinical setting. And it's important to name your loss and your secondary losses, validate your feelings, build up peer support, and find ways to practice rituals which will help you build empathy and trust. So, those are ultimately the things that we can surround ourselves with in the midst of loss that can help us find some way of moving forward kind of through the pain of the loss. Um, and so Pauline kind of breaks this down into kind of 6 of these areas. So the first one is this idea of finding meaning. And so we have this normal, natural human tendency to want to find and make meaning out of the world. But sometimes what happens when we experience a loss is that our assumptive beliefs about the world are shaken or shattered. And what that means is how we find meaningfulness in the world, um, how we feel about the benevolence of the world that we live in, and how we see self-worth in the world, um, are all impacted. And so um, it has an impact on things like how we see the world, what we thought it might be, what are these things that we dread about our world now as a result of this loss. And so all of that means that we might find ourselves struggling with finding meaning. And so finding meaning often means having to reconstruct our narrative in some ways. And so sometimes that can be done through our spiritual belief system, but it can also be done through growth and values, in helping others, in giving back in some ways. And so some things that people have found helpful in terms of beginning to find meaning have been practicing forgiveness, um, doing small good works, having ritual practices, beginning to perceive the world, um, and perceiving suffering as something that's an inevitable universal part of our world. And um, so yeah, so sometimes this can be done through like expressive arts or photography or dance or, all these different ways that we might begin to be able to incorporate that. Um, so tempering mastery. So Pauline Boss really talks about this in terms of we can have this kind of sense of a like learned helplessness. And so when we perceive events as something that we have no control over, then we might find ourselves having this place of hopelessness. And so because we know that ambiguous losses are often chronic, there's not a fix for them, and they involve uncertainty, we have this kind of relationship with control. And so the idea here is, how do we begin to think about what are the things that we can control versus what are the things that are outside of our um, kind of center of control, and how do we begin to name what those things might be? And just in the naming of them gives us a way of beginning to kind of move through that. Reconstructing identity, we've talked about that loss of self-identity. So questions like, who am I now? Who is my family now? What is the role of my loved one now? What roles have I lost? What roles have I gained? What community do I belong to? Where is home? How do we begin to kind of let go of this idea of fixed identity and reconstruct our identity now, that we are living in this place of loss? And so those are all questions that we might ask ourselves. Normalizing ambivalence. We've talked about that ambivalence a lot. And so oftentimes we might experience guilt, or we might have this tendency to label feelings as negative. But really, normalizing ambivalence is like bringing it all out into the open, and beginning to see that all of these emotions um, can be positive, and that they have something to show us or tell us. And it's, how do we become comfortable sitting in the tension that both things can be true? Like we said in the beginning, I can both be grateful that this person is still here and present and alive, but I can also feel really disappointed and discouraged at, at what hope looks like for us right now in this moment. And being able to sit in those tensions and normalizing that. Revisiting attachment. So we've talked about these losses being rooted in relationships and rooted in the attachments that we have for someone. And so this really looks like revisiting how that relationship has changed. And the reality is that even if the relationship has changed, the imprint that a person has on us is still there. And so what are their mannerisms, their gestures, their ways of speaking and communicating their values and their beliefs that have become a part of us, that we can begin to affirm and honor? And also, what are some of those things that maybe we need to relinquish that? Um, and so lots of kind of reviewing of the relationship. What was the love like between you? How do you feel close to this person now? How and when do you know that love lives on in your heart? How has this relationship changed over time? Those are all helpful questions in revisiting this attachment. And the last one is discovering hope. I feel like we could have a whole session just on this one topic. But the reality is that when we have walked through something like an ambiguous loss, our idea of how we define hope has changed. And so discovering hope is, how do we define what hope looks like now? And so oftentimes we think that hope is this sense of wanting life to look like what it was before. And that's just not possible, right? In the reality of this loss. And so it's how do we begin to redefine what hope is? And so maybe hope is that something looks different today than it did before. And so maybe I wasn't able to look at pictures of my healthy, normal child before, but today I can look at that picture and I can smile and I can remember that time. That's holding space for hope, right? And so it's in those little things. And so it's laughing at absurdities in life. It's redefining what justice means, finding forgiveness, and creating rituals are all ways that we can rediscover some hope. I'm going to stop there. I could also go into some uh, grief theories, but I want to leave time for some questions. And so I'll stop here. I've got my contact information up here on the slide, so feel free to take that information down and you can feel free to reach out to me. But yeah, I want to pause for the last about 7 minutes that we have for any questions that you all might have now that I've talked at you for almost an hour.